One morning in the year 2017, a 25-year-old man named Watanabe Takuya woke up inside his quiet apartment in Tokyo, Japan, and immediately knew that something was deeply wrong with his body. He felt incredibly hot and feverish, his skin was drenched in a cold sweat, and his head was pounding with a severe, throbbing pain that seemed to radiate from deep inside his ears. But the most alarming part of his condition was his right ear itself. When he reached up to touch the side of his face, he realized that a steady stream of clear, warm fluid was literally leaking out of his ear canal. He had to keep his hand cupped tightly over his ear just to keep the liquid from running down his neck and soaking his clothes. But despite how strange and unpleasant this was, Takuya did not feel panicked. Instead, his main emotion was actually just pure annoyance. He was annoyed because he had been through this exact kind of scenario before. When Takuya was a teenager, he had been diagnosed with a condition known as a cholesteatoma, which is basically a recurring, non-cancerous skin cyst that grows deep inside the middle ear canal. When he was younger, he had to undergo multiple invasive surgeries to have these cysts removed and to keep them from coming back. For almost a decade, it seemed like those childhood surgeries had worked perfectly because his ears had remained completely dry and healthy. But about 2 weeks earlier, Takuya had noticed a familiar, damp sensation in his ear. At first, he tried to ignore it, hoping it would go away, but now, with a fever and a massive headache, he could no longer deny that he had developed a severe ear infection. Takuya had been working long hours at his job in Tokyo, and the last thing he wanted was to interrupt his routine with medical appointments. He had always believed that most minor ailments would simply run their course if he gave them enough time. But this was different. He remembered the antiseptic smell of the pediatric wards from his childhood and the painful recovery periods that kept him away from his friends. That history made him deeply reluctant to seek help now. But as he sat on the edge of his bed, watching the clear fluid drip onto his bedsheets, he had to admit his stubbornness had finally caught up with him. Takuya walked out of his apartment and made his way to the Keio University Hospital, keeping his hand cupped over his ear the entire time. At the reception desk, he explained his symptoms and his medical history to the receptionist, who quickly checked him into the emergency department. A half hour later, Takuya was lying in an emergency room bed with his eyes tightly closed because the bright overhead lights made his pounding headache feel even worse. A hospital doctor came over to his bedside and explained that based on his history and the fluid leaking from his ear, they were confident that his childhood cyst had returned and caused a major infection. The doctor told Takuya that he would eventually need another surgery to remove the cyst, but they could not operate just yet because they had a much bigger problem to deal with first. The doctor explained that Takuya's preliminary blood tests showed that the ear infection had gotten so advanced that the bacteria had actually spread to the delicate tissues surrounding his brain. This was an extremely dangerous development that could lead to permanent brain damage or even death if left untreated. Takuya felt a wave of shock, followed by anger at himself for waiting 2 weeks to go to the hospital, but he knew he had no choice. He was immediately admitted to the hospital and started on a very high dose of powerful intravenous antibiotics. Fast forward 2 weeks, and Takuya was still lying in his hospital bed. The powerful antibiotics had successfully cleared the dangerous brain infection, but his right ear was still leaking that clear fluid on and off. Because of this, the doctors ordered a high-resolution CT scan of his head so they could map out exactly how they were going to perform the surgery on his ear. Takuya was wheeled down to the radiology department and placed inside the large circular scanning machine. He lay perfectly still for about 5 minutes while the machine took detailed images of the inside of his head, and then a nurse led him back to his room. A little while later, his doctor walked into the room holding a stack of papers, but instead of looking ready for surgery, he had a deeply troubled expression on his face. The doctor told Takuya that he had some very unexpected news. He explained that based on the CT scan, Takuya actually did not need to undergo another ear surgery. For a second, Takuya felt a massive sense of relief, but that feeling instantly vanished when the doctor explained that the reason he did not need surgery was because there was no cyst in his ear at all. The real problem was much, much worse. The doctor handed Takuya a printed image from the CT scan, and Takuya could not believe what he was looking at. The scan showed that Takuya was suffering from an incredibly rare condition called Gorham-Stout disease, which is more commonly known as vanishing bone disease. This is a highly unusual medical mystery where a person's body randomly begins to break down and absorb its own bones, replacing them with abnormal blood vessels. In Takuya's case, his skull was literally melting away like an ice cube. The clear fluid that had been leaking out of his ear for weeks was not ear drainage at all. It was actually cerebrospinal fluid, the vital liquid that cushions the brain, which was now leaking through the physical holes in his disappearing skull. Because there is no known cure for vanishing bone disease, the doctors had to come up with a creative solution. They performed a delicate procedure where they used a special medical glue to literally plug up the holes in Takuya's skull to stop the brain fluid from leaking out. Amazingly, this strange treatment worked, and by the time of his next follow-up appointment in late 2018, Takuya appeared to be doing quite well, with his bone loss finally stabilizing. Before we move on to our next story, I want to share some pretty big news that I know many of you have been waiting to hear. I am going to be doing another live storytelling tour this year, and I cannot wait to hit the road. You can find me in a bunch of different cities, including some brand new stops on the West Coast and across the United States, where I have never performed before. Plus, I am incredibly excited to share that I will also be performing in an international city, since so many of our international fans have been asking me to visit for a very long time. We have put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of brand new, awesome stories, including content that you will not hear anywhere else. Tickets for this tour are available right now at tour.mrballenstudios.com. They range from general admission all the way to VIP packages. Once again, that website is tour.mrballenstudios.com. I am also going to be giving away an incredible trip to meet me in person at one of my live shows, and if you want to enter for your chance to win that, all you have to do is make a donation to win at fandm.com/MrBallen. Go get your tickets today, and I cannot wait to see you there. One afternoon in late January of the year 2018, a father named Dan Levitas was standing inside the shared bathroom of his home in Madison, Wisconsin. Dan grabbed his children's toothbrushes and threw them directly into the garbage can. Then, he picked up a bottle of chemical disinfectant and began spraying down every single surface in the room. He sprayed the countertops, the sink, the faucets, the mirror, and the toilet, and then began aggressively wiping everything down with a rag. Dan was doing this because his entire household was locked in a miserable, endless cycle of illness. Dan, his wife, and their 3 young kids had all been diagnosed with strep throat. According to their family doctor, the only way to get rid of the highly contagious bacteria was for everyone to take a full course of antibiotics at the same time while deep cleaning the entire house to kill any lingering germs on physical surfaces. But as Dan scrubbed the bathroom counters, he felt incredibly frustrated and defeated. This was because this was not the first time his family had dealt with strep throat. In fact, over the course of just the last 4 months, his entire family had contracted strep throat 6 separate times. No matter how many antibiotics they took or how many times they disinfected the house, they always got sick again. This recurring nightmare was deeply baffling to Dan, not just as a parent, but also because of his professional background. Dan was actually a trained biologist, so he understood how bacteria lived, how it reproduced, and how it spread. Because of his scientific training, he had already systematically investigated every logical source of the infection. He checked with his coworkers and his wife's coworkers to see if anyone at their offices was sick, but the answer was always no. He checked with the staff at his children's school and their daycare facility, but there were no active outbreaks of strep throat there either. This meant the infection had to be coming from somewhere inside their own home. But that conclusion made no sense to him either, because each time they got sick, Dan disinfected the entire house, wiping down every single toy, light switch, and surface. Somehow, the bacteria was surviving his extreme cleaning efforts, and he did not know where it was. Dan walked into the kitchen, grabbed the family's antibiotic prescriptions from the counter, and began distributing the doses. He gave the medicine to his 2 daughters, who were 6 and 3 years old, as they lay in their beds looking completely miserable. Then he went into the master bedroom, where his wife was holding their sick 1-year-old son, who was burning up with a fever, to make sure he was not missing anything. Dan had even created a highly detailed map of their house on graph paper. He tracked the movements of each family member, trying to trace where they spent most of their time. He had systematically washed their bed sheets on the highest temperature setting and boiled the plastic toys his children played with. As a scientist, he knew that bacteria had to have a living host or a damp environment to survive, but his thorough cleaning should have eliminated any environmental reservoir. It was incredibly frustrating to feel like he was failing to protect his family. He spent hours every night reading medical journals, looking for any recorded cases of mutated bacteria that could survive standard cleaning agents, but found absolutely nothing that explained this persistent cycle. It broke Dan's heart to see his children suffering like this over and over again, and he felt completely powerless to protect them. They were following their doctor's instructions perfectly, yet nothing was changing, and it felt like they were trapped in an inescapable loop. Feeling defeated, Dan remembered that his mother was a retired pediatrician who had decades of experience treating childhood illnesses. He decided to call her to ask for advice. His mother listened to the history of the infections and offered a highly unusual theory about where the bacteria was hiding. But because Dan was a biologist, his immediate reaction was skepticism. He knew that based on standard medical science and veterinary literature, his mother's theory was considered highly improbable, if not completely impossible. Most medical experts would have dismissed it immediately, but because they were so desperate, Dan decided to try to test her theory anyway. He began calling local veterinary clinics and medical laboratories in the area, explaining the situation and asking if they would perform the test. But to his frustration, every single expert he contacted turned him down, Telling him that his theory was medically impossible and refusing to help, by early March the situation became critical. Dan and his wife found themselves sitting in a cold hospital room, staring down at their 3-year-old daughter. She was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to an intravenous line and wearing an oxygen mask over her face. She had contracted strep throat for the 7th time, but this time her body was too weak to fight it off, and she had developed a severe case of pneumonia. The doctors told them that their daughter was critically ill, and they did not know if she was going to survive. Dan was on the verge of a complete psychological breakdown, knowing he had to find someone to test his mother's theory to protect his family. As they sat by their daughter's bed, Dan's wife suggested a different approach. She asked if instead of reaching out to established medical professionals, they should try contacting medical or veterinary students at the local university, thinking a student might be more open-minded and willing to help. Dan agreed that it was worth a try, and they reached out to the University of Wisconsin. To their immense relief, this final plan actually worked. On April 4th, 2018, Dan and his wife took a swab sample from their home and brought it to the University of Wisconsin Veterinary School, where a veterinary student had agreed to analyze it. When the student ran the diagnostic tests, the results showed that their crazy theory was absolutely correct. It turned out that the human members of the family were not the only ones suffering from strep throat. There was a 6th member of the household who was also infected, their beloved pet cat. Traditionally, most veterinarians believe that domestic cats could not catch the specific strain of strep bacteria that infects humans, let alone act as carriers and transmit it back to people, which is why every local vet had refused to run the test. But the student at the university proved them all wrong. The cat was indeed carrying the exact same strain of strep. Every time the family finished their antibiotics and cleaned the house, they would pet their cat, and the cat would immediately pass the bacteria right back to them. Once the cat was treated with feline-safe antibiotics and the family finished their final round of medicine, the strep went away for good. On September 30th, 1964, a 44-year-old woman named Charlotte Lawrence stood with her husband outside her parents' apartment in a small city in southwestern Germany. Charlotte took a deep, shaky breath, unlocked the front door, and stepped slowly inside. She was there because both of her parents had suddenly and tragically died just a few days earlier. They were 70 and 76 years old and had been in good health, but her father had suffered a massive heart attack while standing in the kitchen, and her mother had a heart attack from the sheer shock of finding his body. By the time the doctor arrived, both were dead. Charlotte and her husband had flown in from Wisconsin to handle their affairs, and looking around the quiet apartment, the absolute weight of her grief came crashing down on her, and she broke down in tears. Her husband turned on the television to fill the heavy silence and guided Charlotte to the couch to rest before dinner. They had plans that evening with their next-door neighbor, an elderly woman named Caroline, who had offered to come over and cook dinner for them, and Charlotte's uncle, Dieter, also planned to come by after dinner. The journey from Wisconsin had been long and exhausting, involving multiple flights and a quiet train ride through the German countryside. The jet lag had left them both feeling disconnected from reality, and the heavy, overcast autumn weather only added to the gloomy atmosphere. Charlotte had spent the entire trip rehearsing what she would do, but nothing could have prepared her for the wave of sorrow that hit her the moment she smelled her mother's favorite lavender perfume lingering in the hallway. Her husband held her hand tightly, but they both knew the coming days would be incredibly hard. Charlotte tried to focus on the small tasks, but every object in the apartment seemed to hold a memory. Soon, Caroline arrived carrying groceries and went straight into the kitchen to begin cooking a traditional German meal. Within a short period of time, the wonderful, warm aroma of food filled the apartment, which made Charlotte feel much better. When dinner was ready, Charlotte and her husband sat at the kitchen table and ate with Caroline while they waited for Dieter to arrive. A short while later, Uncle Dieter walked up to the apartment building, climbed the stairs, and knocked on the front door. But after a full minute of knocking, there was no answer. Dieter could hear the television playing inside, but he could not hear any voices or movement. He waited, knocked again, and then decided to use his spare key to let himself in. He walked through the living room, calling out for Charlotte and the others, but the apartment remained completely silent. A strange feeling of unease began to settle in Dieter's stomach as he walked down the hallway toward the kitchen. When Dieter stepped into the kitchen, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, sitting around the kitchen table, were Charlotte, her husband, and Caroline. At first glance, it looked like they were simply in the middle of their meal, with their plates of food half-eaten in front of them, but none of them were moving. They were completely stationary, sitting upright in their chairs like wax figures, staring straight ahead with blank, empty eyes. Dieter stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest, and gently shook Charlotte's shoulder, calling her name. But her body was completely stiff, and she did not respond. When he looked closely at their faces, his stomach dropped in absolute horror. All three of them were dead, frozen at the table. Dieter immediately ran out of the apartment to call the police, a decision that ultimately saved his life. It would turn out that Charlotte's parents did not die of spontaneous heart attacks at all. A broken sewer pipe under the kitchen sink had been slowly leaking highly toxic, odorless, and colorless sewer gas into the apartment. The concentration of the gas in the enclosed kitchen had become incredibly high, which poisoned her parents and stopped their hearts. Because the gas was completely invisible and had no smell, Charlotte, her husband, and Caroline had no idea that they were walking into a highly toxic environment. As they sat at the table to eat the warm dinner, they breathed in the lethal gas, which quickly overwhelmed their nervous systems and caused them to pass out and die within minutes, frozen in their physical positions. The only reason Uncle Dieter survived that night was because he did not stay in the apartment, as his decision to immediately run out of the building to call for help saved him from breathing in a fatal dose of the invisible deadly gas. The tragedy left a haunting mark on the local community, serving as a dark reminder of how quickly and silently an invisible danger can claim the lives of an entire family. When the specialized investigation teams finally went into the building with protective masks and air monitoring equipment, they discovered that the toxic mixture of gases had accumulated in the lower levels of the building and risen directly through the structural gaps in the floor. The plumbing system in the old building was post-war, and a small crack in the main pipe had slowly expanded over several weeks. It was a completely silent and undetectable killer. The city subsequently ordered comprehensive checks on all the surrounding buildings to ensure that a tragedy of this scale would never occur again. But for Dieter and the rest of the surviving relatives, the apartment building would forever remain a grim monument to a devastating family loss. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.